Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is going to be helping me out with the voiceover today, so I hope you enjoy.
Number 10. Attila the Hun. Born in 406 AD, Attila the Hun was perhaps one of the evilest rulers of the 5th century. During the time he was born, the Huns were led by his uncle, and Attila was kept as a prisoner by the Roman Empire as a hostage. As long as Attila remained imprisoned, the Huns agreed to not attack. This was probably what inspired his reign of terror to begin once his uncle died. Attila was released and he went on the offensive. He gathered together all the great tribes of the Hun, the nomadic people who were already in control of huge parts of Central Asia and Russia. He then took them on a campaign of terror. They tore through over 100 cities, killed countless people, pillaged everything they could, assaulted the city of Constantinople, and even besieged Rome. It was Attila the Hun that led the conquest of the civilized world and helped plunge Europe into the Dark Ages. Until the 5th century, Rome was the single entity responsible for keeping Europe functioning. They conquered most of Europe in pretty barbaric ways, but after a few hundred years, things were finally settling down. There was the Western Roman Empire based in Rome and the newer Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople. But when Attila the Hun swept through Europe like a plague, he tore down much of the Roman Empire and caused a lot of chaos. He was ultimately defeated at one of the bloodiest battles in history around 451 AD. The Visigoths, Franks, and Burgundians formed an alliance and wiped out Attila the Hun. Then, with Rome in shambles, those armies who had been outside the empire plunged Europe into hundreds of years of bloodshed and anarchy. Number 9. King John. King John is considered by many scholars to be one of the worst kings in English history. With unprovoked acts of cruelty, King John was the master. You may recognize his name from the fable of Robin Hood as the anti-hero's enemy, and there's a reason for that, because King John was awful. Bad King John, as he was called, became the King of England in 1199. He ruled for only 17 years. He lost most of his lands to the King of France, which resulted in the devastating collapse of the English monarchy. When his brother Richard the Lionheart was captured in battle, instead of paying his ransom, John negotiated to have him kept in prison longer. He also murdered his nephew Arthur of Brittany because he was a threat to his throne. Some historians believe John beat his nephew to death in a drunken rage and then tossed his body in the river. King John was so awful, he even fell out of favor with Pope Innocent III and was excommunicated between 1209 and 1213. John was described as cowardly, cruel, and senselessly violent. John starved a lot of people to death, and on more than one occasion. And yet he was the one who granted the original Magna Carta, one of the most important documents in Western history. It gave the king limitations on his power and would be part of the motivation behind 2 English civil wars and the American War of Independence. Number 8. Pharaoh Akhenaten. Pharaoh Akhenaten is one of the worst kings of Egypt that ever ruled. From the moment he sat on the throne, he had some pretty bizarre ideas. One of the big things he wanted to do was dismantle and reorganize the entire Egyptian religion. All the gods and goddesses were to be banished. The religion that the Egyptians had been dedicated to for thousands of years was to be abolished, all in favor of a new god called Aten. This was the god of the sun, and it suited Akhenaten better if everyone worshipped him instead of the large pantheon they were used to. To help see this vision come to life, the pharaoh had the capital city of Thebes replaced by a new capital that hadn't even been built yet. It would be called Amarna, and it was a disaster. Just imagine the chaos that changing the capital of Egypt and abolishing all the favorite gods must have caused. We now have archaeological evidence of what happened. An expedition to Amarna turned up some horrible evidence back in 2008. Researchers discovered that roughly 2/3 of the population died before they ever turned 20. They were almost all malnourished, 60% had broken bones, and it was pretty clear from the evidence they had lived miserable lives. The moment the pharaoh died, the city of Amarna was abandoned, and things went right back to the way they used to be. Number 7. Emperor Tan Tai. Emperor Tan Tai of the Nguyen dynasty ruled Vietnam between 1889 and 1907. Some historians say he was eccentric and mentally deranged, and while there are some who say his madness was a fabrication by the French invaders to make him look weak, others say he was indeed mentally disturbed. Things got so out of hand with the emperor that he needed to be detained and overthrown. At the peak of his madness in 1907, it was said that the emperor fed one of his wives naked to a pack of tigers. He had another of his wives shot to death and a third tortured in unspeakable ways. It was written in a French newspaper that the king went totally mad and gave in to bloodthirsty sadism. The palace in those last days was like something from the depraved days of Rome when Caligula was emperor. He had a harem of women trapped inside the palace walls, and they each wound up dead from some hideous experiment or another, until finally Tan Tai was trapped in the palace and never allowed back out until his exile. He was banished, then shipped off to the extremely remote La Réunion Island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. He wasn't allowed back in Vietnam until they declared independence in 1945. Number 6. The Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were a very important European family that many people have never heard of. They ruled Europe for hundreds of years, from the 13th century to the 20th century. The monarchy had a huge empire that included places like Hungary, Romania, Poland, Croatia, and many more. Back then, most of the kings and queens were related. It's still true even now. For example, Richard Nixon was supposedly a distant cousin of Queen Elizabeth, and cousins with Herbert Hoover. In medieval times, the king of one country was probably a brother or cousin or some distant relation with the king of the country next door. And this is how the Habsburgs ruled for 700 years. It began in 1273, when Rudolf I became the Roman German king. Rudolf claimed Austria, allowed his sons to rule over it, and from there they spread out. It was more of a clan of nobles than just kings, but they all had the same blood, and they dictated all that happened in Europe. And while some of them were more awful than others, they were all quite odd for one main reason. They bred with each other so many times that they created their very own medical problem. A team found 18 different anomalies in Habsburg faces and used the portraits to calculate the degree to which different members of the Habsburg family were inbred. It's called the Habsburg jaw, the result of almost 1,000 years of incestuous breeding. The medical term is mandibular prognatism. It's when the jaw sticks out so far that it causes an extreme and unnatural underbite. The teeth don't line up, and the face ends up looking extremely bizarre. Skeletal problems, neuromuscular problems, all kinds of stuff, and it was all from keeping it in the family. Number 5. Yonsengun. Yonsengun ruled the great Joseon dynasty of Korea at the turn of the 15th century. Born in 1483, he came to power at a very young age as the 10th king of the dynasty and ruled with an iron fist. Many historians consider him to be the worst ruler in Korean history. He was responsible for 2 major massacres of scholarly elites that he claimed were up to no good. But it wasn't only the bloodshed that made him so awful. Instead, it was his thirst for depravity. The ruler had over 1,000 women abducted from the various provinces in Korea, brought to the palace, and kept there as prisoners to be entertainers. He killed anyone who commented on his poor behavior and forced people into slave labor to build a giant personal brothel and his own hunting grounds. This resulted in the demolition of a residential area and the eviction of over 20,000 people. His lust got so out of control that finally in 1506, the king was deposed and replaced by his half-brother, Grand Prince Jinsong. Yonsengun was exiled and banished from the kingdom, but died only a few weeks later under mysterious circumstances. In the weeks that followed, so did all 4 of his young sons. Number 4. Emperor Andronicus I Komnenos. Andronicus I Komnenos, once the emperor of the Byzantines from 1183 to 1185. He ruled the lands for a measly 2 years, and in that brief time he earned the nickname Misophase, which translates roughly to hater of sunlight. He earned his name because of his fascination with blinding his enemies. Because Andronicus was born to royalty, he lived a pretty easy life and had a very privileged childhood. But in 1141 he was handed over to the Turks as a prisoner and forced to stay with them for 1 year. After they paid his ransom and he returned to Constantinople, he became a commander. This was all 30 years before he rose to power. When Emperor Manuel died in 1180, he was succeeded by his son Alexios II, a boy of only 10. It was his mother, Maria of Antioch, who took care of the royal business. Her Latin origins soured the Greek subjects of the Byzantine Empire, since they blamed the Latin bankers for stealing their wealth. And so, Andronicus used this to his advantage. He marched to Constantinople with an army, then massacred every single Latin resident there. Thousands of people were killed. Maria of Antioch was butchered, so was Alexios, and suddenly Andronicus was king. He then tried to abolish the aristocracy. He tried to wipe out all the most important people in Constantinople, starting with the wealthy families. There was too much corruption, and he wanted a fresh start. But all this murder led to chaos. The city erupted in riots, and Andronicus was set upon by the ruling families, who didn't feel like being executed. He was chased out of the city in 1185, and nobody knows what happened to him. Number 3. Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler was the Prince of Wallachia in 15th century Romania. He was born in 1431 in Transylvania, and he wasn't actually a vampire. Through the years, a lot of different pieces of his story have been put together to make things a little confusing. But here's what actually happened. In 1431, Vlad's father, Vlad II, was introduced into the Order of the Dragon and given the surname Dracul. It's just a fancy word for dragon. When Vlad III was born, he became the son of Dracul, or Dracula. When Bram Stoker was doing research for his book Dracula, he thought the name was Wallachian for devil, and so he decided that was what he wanted to name his vampire in his new book. Stoker didn't even know anything about Vlad the Impaler, but really just liked the name Dracula. Still, Vlad the Impaler didn't get his name without reason. He was an absolutely horrifying ruler, and not a very good one either. The local nobles deposed him after he sat on the throne for 2 months. Nobody even knows where he was between 1448 and 1456. All we really know is that after Constantinople fell in 1453, Vlad led a small army against the Ottomans, who tried to invade Wallachia. Since he was successful, he won back his throne. In order to keep the throne once and for all, he had all the noblemen in the area impaled on spikes so that they couldn't rise up against him ever again. Number 2. Eric XIV of Sweden. Eric XIV of Sweden was called the Butcher King. He was born on December 13th, 1533, and his mother died when he was just 2 years old. He was incredibly smart, excelling in language and math as a child. But this intelligence possibly made him dangerous. As a young man, he faced a brutal string of rejections. He started asking all the greatest female rulers in Europe if they would be his wife, including Mary, Queen of Scots. They all turned him down, even Queen Elizabeth I. In 1560, Eric's father died, and he became king. He immediately demoted all the royals, so that nobody could try to take his place. And in 1563, he started getting paranoid. Eric arrested his brother for high treason, started executing people for frivolous reasons, and was the dictionary version of cruel and unusual punishments. In 1566, one of his punishments was when he forced a man named Niles Storr to drive through Stockholm in a broken carriage while wearing a straw hat. It was unusual and embarrassing because Niles' wounds from his torture were still bleeding as he went through the streets, with people laughing at him. Number 1. King Ahab. King Ahab, according to the Old Testament, was probably the worst king of Israel. He was the king back in the days when the country was split into two separate entities, Israel and Judea. In the book of Kings, it's said that King Ahab did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any who came before him. And this is probably because he was a worshipper of the pagan gods, Baal and Asherah. He was also the husband of the Sidonian princess Jezebel, one of the wickedest women described in the Bible. Unfortunately, we don't actually know if King Ahab was a real person. Many of the figures in the Bible were real historical people, but we don't know for sure. There is some evidence since the mention of King Ahab was found in Assyrian documents from 853 BC, but it's never been confirmed. Ahab wasn't wicked for murdering people or having too many concubines. It was his worship of Baal, which was the anti-god from 3,000 years ago. And because of his worship and his scheming with Jezebel, Israel suffered. Ahab was also supposedly responsible for murdering a man who owned a vineyard near his castle. Ahab wanted to turn a vineyard into a vegetable garden. The man refused to sell it to him, and so Ahab had him killed. In the end, his wicked ways caught up to him, and he was killed in battle against Aram. An arrow hit him, he fell off his chariot, and he was last seen allegedly bleeding to death in a pool where people washed themselves. Which of these kings was the all-time worst? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, and come back again soon for more shocking historical videos. Bye.